This video is sponsored by Keeps. More on them later. Ladies and gentlemen, today I would like to talk about one of the biggest threats to our continued enjoyment of video games. Let's face it, there's more than a few out there, but the more I think about the relationship that video games have with realism, the more toxic it seems. But hold on, RabbidLuigi, I thought that realism is a really good thing that people often praise games for. Why would it ever be a bad thing? Well, that all comes down to where you draw the line on realism and how it manifests in certain games that are trying to replicate a certain realistic thing. Perhaps if you're spending all your time trying to make something realistic, you're neglecting other far more important areas? There's a ton of different ways of looking at it, and I'm going to try and cover as many of them as possible. Obviously, you can't expect me to cover absolutely everything related to this topic because, you know, that's not very realistic. I've been sitting on this video idea in one form or another for quite a while now, and I think it's actually going to cover everything from realistic graphics to whether or not video games are too violent these days, and it has been a bit of a headache getting this thing written. So much so that I can feel the stress rise up and the hairs on my head run for the hills, but fortunately this video is sponsored by Keeps and their FDA approved treatment for hair loss. You know, nothing's more realistic than losing your hair. But hold that thought. Years ago, the concept of staving off the inevitable march of hair loss was the least realistic thing you could imagine, and yet this video sponsors Keeps have made huge strides in the science of preventing hair loss. 2 out of 3 guys will experience some form of male pattern baldness before they turn 35, and so we have to be thankful that Keeps are doing so much good work in this field. These guys are very clever when it comes to preventing hair loss with their FDA-approved treatment that comes with years of experience and loads of successful cases under their belts. In fact, they're so smart that they know that hair loss is different from one guy to the next, which is why their treatment comes in 3 different variants depending on what kind of hair loss you're experiencing. Plus, you can get everything shipped directly to your door, so you don't have to wait for the world to not be so terrible before you can fix your hair. Keeps' treatment packages are already cheaper than their competitors, but with the deal they're running with me here today, you can save even more money. For a limited time off, you can go to keeps.com/rabbid or click the link in the description to receive 50% off your first order. Stop hair loss now before it's too late. Okay, let's get real for a second. I don't really know where to start with all of this, because talking about and judging realism in video games is really hard and kind of exists on a sliding scale. If you want to put too much thought into it, you could argue that a bunch of early games are actually quite realistic. Pac-Man, for example, it's realistic that the ghost would chase Pac-Man around this maze since ghosts are traditionally scary, and it's also realistic that Pac-Man would want to eat all those pellets because they look damn tasty. So is Pac-Man realistic? Yeah, kind of. Depends what your threshold is like for realism. It's hard to make a game that has absolutely zero real-world parallels, so I do have to narrow down my search somewhat so that we can discuss some realism that is a little more relevant. You're going to be hearing the word realism a lot in this video, so I might as well try to nail down some kind of definition, and Google's pretty handy for this. The quality or fact of representing a person or thing in a way that is accurate and true to life, which is just a fancy way of saying that something fictional or artificial is reflective of real life in one way or another. Easy to see how this would apply to video games, since you're typically controlling characters in scenarios that have at least some passing semblance to real life, even in the most fantastical settings, and the question with every game is how far it goes with realism. But how do you measure realism? Is a game more realistic if it has elements that are directly referencing real life, like the sprawling city of Los Santos in GTA 5? Or is it more realistic if the unrealistic fantasy setting is convincingly imagined, like Link taking damage when in cold environments in Breath of the Wild? Like I said, realism comes in lots of different flavors, and it's very hard to get a grasp on any true metric for realism. So we're not going to bother with any of that, and instead unpack what too much realism looks like. So I know this video is titled like a question so as to try to stimulate a debate on this topic, and also to try to get people to watch my videos for a change, but I'll answer it for you right now. Games can absolutely be too realistic. There's a balancing act that needs doing so that a game can be reflective of the enjoyable parts of real life while making sure to streamline the slower, more aggravating parts, and I feel like there's a few games out there that forget to do the second bit. A relentless pursuit of realism above anything else can blind a game's developer to some other important features that are undoubtedly more vital to a game being enjoyable. And while making a game as realistically as possible is often an impressive technical exercise, it likely wouldn't be the most appealing part of the majority of games out there. Red Dead Redemption 2 is a fascinating case study in how to almost get realism perfect in a game, because fuck me sideways, this is an absolutely stunning game to look at. The work done to ensure that this game has convincing environments and beautiful vistas to gaze at is so impressive, and this is carried forward to a lot of the animations and motion capture work, and the way you have to sit there for a full 20 seconds every time Arthur Morgan skins an animal, and the shrinking and expanding horse testicles based on the surrounding temperature. This seems like an unnecessary addition for a game to have. Like, I know why Red Dead Redemption 2 has done stuff like this, because I'm sure the design brief was for this game to focus on realism and to have as many of these little details as possible, but I do struggle to find the inherent value in this sort of stuff. The horse balls are fine, I guess, since they technically don't get in your way unless you go somewhere really hot like an active volcano, and then the balls expand so much that they destroy the world! But lengthy animations actively work against a player's enjoyment of the game. Yes, technically, if I was to go out hunting for animal skins right now, I'd have to stop recording this video, but I'd also have to sit there and actually spend a lot longer than 20 seconds skinning each animal, so it's not even that realistic. But when applied to a video game where there's more intended value here than simply skinning animals all day, it does start to become an inconvenience by about the third animal skin. That's the thing, I can appreciate how much work was put into animations like this, but this should never be the focus of Red Dead Redemption 2. I don't know if you've played it before, but there's actually a lot more going on here other than hunting animals, like exciting gunplay and an incredible story full of twists and turns and just, I don't want to spend my life watching Arthur skin a bear. I have other things that I want to do. Play a different game if you want that. Realism is the sort of thing that should never be prioritized over more traditionally valuable components of video game design. Sacrificing a bit of realism in order to streamline a video game and to make it more fun should always be preferable, since the average player is far more likely to recommend a game to others off the back of some sick nasty gameplay than some fancy animations. This is a known quantity among games developers, and something that has been satirized in the past. Desert Bus is a classic example of a game that is fiercely dedicated to realism to the point of requiring the player to watch the desert go by all throughout the literal 8-hour bus drive from Tucson to Las Vegas. Clearly a joke and most likely a trick because of who made it, but this is more like parody realism, the sort that a game would never seriously be built around for obvious reasons. It's worth remembering why people play video games in the first place and the role they have in providing an escapist fantasy from real life. And yes, there is a large dose of personal preference at play here, but I reckon most people sitting down to play a game after a long, hard day's work won't want an experience that reminds them too much of real-world problems and inconveniences. Then again, if you're in the market of losing yourself in a realistic fantasy world, then the more care taken towards bringing that world to life, the better. And I suppose that speaks more to the kind of balance that needs to be achieved here. If value can be added to the overall experience by dipping everything in a coat of hyper-realism, then absolutely go for it, but you gotta be careful. If realism becomes frustrating to experience, then fuck, I might as well have never started playing in the first place. It's more of a question of how highly you value immersion in a game, and if you're after that truly immersive experience, it may well require an awkwardly high level of realism to pull it off. If it pulls you out of the moment, like having to sit around for 5 minutes to watch a dozen animals get skinned, then maybe it's worth reevaluating just how realistic you want a game to be. What do you want to get out of a game? We only ask the tricky questions on this show. Making a game realistic clearly takes a lot of work. You're not just developing a game so that it can carry out a set number of processes so that a player reaches one of several win or loss conditions. There's an extra layer of polish required to throw a player off the scent that they're playing a video game and not experiencing some magical adventure through the eyes of a protagonist that they're living through vicariously. If you think about where the technological advancements have been in video game development over the years, there's been steps taken optimizing how data is stored and read by a console, but mostly it's been on how a game is presented to the player. Compare Super Mario World from 1990 and New Super Mario Bros. U from 2012, and among a long list of changes, the biggest is the presentation with a more graphically intensive art style and fluid animations. It's the easiest way of demonstrating progress and a handy tool for the marketing department to prove to customers that this new game is just straight up better than the previous ones. It looks better, it probably plays better. This is me tiptoeing around the wider discussion of graphics versus gameplay, which I really don't want to go into today, because I have a family and finite time on this earth, and I really don't have the energy for that comment section. But for now, I'll say games are more under pressure than ever before to have good graphics. That's just the world we live in, and depending on what type of game you're making and its target audience, you may well be aiming for more than simply good graphics. If you're trying to make a realistic survival game or a shooter, then you really ought to have photorealistic graphics to go with. Realistic graphics is an arms race that I never really cared about beyond watching those demos for the latest new engine and being impressed at just how many polygons are being blasted into my corneas. But the inevitable truth is that if you're aiming for a game to be realistic, you better get to work on those graphics, my friend. The technology has progressed to the point where we're using motion capture on every important character in the game and rendering environments in painstaking detail, but the angle I want to approach all this from is the amount of work that goes into making a game look like this. It's a hell of a lot of coding and rigging of 3D models with hundreds of animations so that a character doesn't act artificial, and you multiply that across the breadth of a AAA video game and oh, that's a lot of work. I've talked about video game crunch on a few occasions on this channel, so I'll give you the cliff notes. Crunch is a really bad but really common practice in the games industry where employees work 100 hours a week to get a game over the line. It's become so commonplace because games developers have only recently decided to create workers' unions, and it's seen as such an important component of the dev cycle that is required in order for a game to be released on time. There's other bits and pieces we can go into, but the main thing here is that ramming all this realism into a game isn't quite the fun eye for detail that it seems, and is more than likely a result of someone working long hours with little to no breaks in between. I don't think it's controversial to say that I'd sacrifice bushes being pushed aside as a player walks through them in favour of the workforce not being worked into an early grave. So here's the question I'm asking: how sustainable are realistic graphics? Sure, they're a nice goal to aim for and a technical achievement when done well, but with the way that technology is going, what was realistic 15 to 20 years ago looks goofy and uncanny by today's sky-high standards. Is there any point in stretching your staff and your resources to breaking point and sweating bullets over pores being perfectly sculpted onto a character's face when this will all be obsolete in a few years anyway? This whole video is actually a cry for help from me over what Nintendo are doing to their Mario renders because we're careening into the uncanny valley and I hate it. I need Nintendo to be more considerate of my feelings. Realism can take darker forms when the occasion arises. The wider picture is that life has a lot of horrifying sides to it if you're willing to put them in the spotlight, and given how video games are always knocking on the door of being art, you can expect the occasional video game to push the boundaries of what video games can and can't show. Age certificates help to steer mature content away from younger audiences, but even adults may struggle to stomach the darkest sides of humanity. Mortal Kombat has had a unique approach to realism for decades, with its violent fatalities being equal parts beloved and controversial. I suppose they're not realistic in the slightest when you look at them closely, since the human body doesn't work like this, but when the competition has far less lethal looking character deaths, this is streaks ahead of anything else out there. So much so that it helped to poke the bear with regards to violent video games, with these fatalities being realistic enough that legal teams were involved, and hey presto, that's how the rating system was born. It didn't put off the team behind Mortal Kombat though, and many years later we're up to 11 of these games now. The latest installment brings up an extra problem though, and this does feed back into my concerns about the developers working on all this realism, albeit from a slightly different angle. Implementing something so realistically is a lot of work and requires an eye for detail that has to be challenging to maintain, but can you imagine for a second what it must be like realistically designing and modelling a human body, including all the organs and bones, and then fucking tearing it apart? Not to mention that if you want truly authentic realism and for the characters to die realistically, you're gonna need something to copy. A story did the round shortly after Mortal Kombat 11 came out that a member of the dev team had to seek therapy after they started having extremely violent dreams. This came while they were working in an environment that was full of people watching executions, animals being slaughtered, and police reports of murder victims, and yeah, I suppose that's the best way of making violence as realistic as possible, but come on. A similar story cropped up with The Last of Us Part 2, which was a vicious dev cycle for many other reasons as well, but that is another game where characters die gruesomely and realistically. Along with Red Dead Redemption 2, this is probably the most realistically gory game I've ever played, since Mortal Kombat is just a little too ridiculous to take seriously, and a lot of the realism comes from seeing NPCs react to being shot in different places. Shoot their leg and they'll stumble, shoot their leg with something powerful and they'll scream in agony as they clutch where their leg used to be. Shoot them in the face, and if their head doesn't explode like a watermelon, it'll struggle to resemble anything recognizable. It's a pretty awesome system they've made, and wonderful for keeping the realism up, but you gotta know that the research to achieve this level of realism involved looking at a lot of grisly images and videos. I don't really know what a real human head looks like when it's been hit with a shotgun shell, and no one working on a game should be required to find out. Violent video games in general will always be put under heavy scrutiny for how news outlets seem to knee-jerk in their direction whenever the need arises. They're given the same treatment as whatever nugget of pop culture suits an agenda, but the focus is especially sharp towards video games, with their perceived violence being a key contributing factor for the destruction of society. The studies are decades old and have long since disproven the link between video games and real-world violence, but when I see games portray death and injuries this realistically, it does make me a little uncomfortable deep down in my stomach. Clearly, there's no direct correlation between someone playing a gruesome video game and deciding to pick up an automatic weapon and shoot up a school, but I don't think this helps with gaming's public image. I think it's foolish to say that this sort of realism isn't at least a little bit desensitizing, but that's honestly as far as it goes beyond giving stupid people more fuel for their big stupid dumpster fire of an argument. I'd argue it isn't worth all the hassle in the first place. Would The Last of Us Part 2 be that much worse off with tamer gore? Might even be a worthwhile game to play at that point. Which actually segues nicely into perhaps the one genre of gaming that can actually get away with making everything as realistic as possible. Simulators. And yeah, obviously, it's kind of in their name. If you're deciding to play a simulation of something, you can't have any complaints if that game puts everything on hold in favor of copying the experience as close to one-to-one as physically possible. The simulations will often go the extra mile to distinguish themselves from conventional video games, and as soon as you declare yourself a simulator, you can ignore a lot of what makes up a normal video game. Sure, you can make it fun, but if you're playing something like Microsoft Flight Simulator and complaining that there aren't enough Pokemon, then what are you even doing? However, in a similar vein to the Uncanny Valley, the closer you get to mimicking real life, the more you're in danger of falling short. The landscapes in MFS are AI generated that interprets satellite data and generally works really well, until it replaces Buckingham Palace with a block of flats. The more you're trying to replicate real life, the further you have to fall when something goes wrong. I haven't really mentioned glitches yet, mainly because they're an unintended side effect of game development, but realism kinda takes a backseat when the game bugs out big time. I remember swimming around in Battlefield's multiplayer lobbies. Ah, how the time flies. Anyway, that is exactly way too much of a video on a problem that I've invented and I'm fairly sure no one cares about, but I had to have my say somehow. Clearly the realistic approach to game design isn't going anywhere in a hurry, as it's still the best angle to approach most AAA games from to showcase progress, but hopefully I've highlighted some of the issues with realism and how it can spiral wildly out of control. So the next time you're playing a modern video game and you find yourself thinking, wow, this is so realistic, I want you to think about what you're saying and see if why is this so realistic fits better. Or, you know, if you got the time, you can wonder if you actually care about if a game is realistic or not. Listen, if you had the time to watch this video, you for sure have time for the homework. I'm sure there's people watching this video at home who've heard all my arguments and still don't really think there's much of a problem here, and you are perfectly entitled to have that opinion, but don't say I didn't warn you. You know, when things get really weird, you know, you could have been more prepared. This is RabbidLuigi, and if you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more in the future. And if you want to watch a video right here, there's a video here about the easiest bosses in all the Soulsborne games. I also want to thank my top supporters on Patreon, including Scott Riker, Sarah Malion, and the Green Scorpion. Thank you for watching, and if you die in real life, you die in the game. Wait.